My name is Ilara Vance. I am 46 years old and reside in Bayview, North Carolina, a quiet, historic city. Not long ago, my life was radically restructured when my husband, Barnaby, died suddenly of a heart attack. It was completely unexpected. The hospital delivered the news. He had passed away alone, immediately after spending yet another solo weekend at the Riverside Retreat. That location, the small structure on the edges of the coastal marshes, had been an enduring mystery throughout our 2 decades of marriage, established as an exclusive, almost sacred space reserved solely for him. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting in complete silence, struggling to absorb the reality of the words. I didn't cry immediately. I felt more emptiness than pain. Barnaby was a man defined by rigid rules, regulations, and awkward silences. Our 20-year relationship had long dissolved into a cold, predictable routine punctuated by his frequent absences. I had learned to navigate our life by not asking questions, not offering opinions, and not getting in his way. With his death, I wasn't sure if I was mourning him or mourning everything I had lost of myself. Though I wept at the funeral, what truly resonated deep inside was not sadness, but a perplexing mix of confusion and profound relief. A part of me felt guilty for not being completely devastated, for not missing a man who had successfully made me feel utterly invisible for over 2 decades. Barnaby was intensely controlling. He dictated my clothing, criticized my manner of speaking, and even decided when I was permitted to visit my family. His word was always final. I was a mere background figure in the carefully orchestrated drama of his life. I never held a job because he insisted it was unnecessary, that his salary was more than enough. This financial security meant I had no independence, no say, and no voice. Every suggestion I offered was dismissed with short phrases, hidden contempt lurking behind a practiced, dry smile. I had slowly faded away, and now facing his absence, I began to hear a new sound inside me, my own silence. The decades of unspoken thoughts I had locked away were finally seeking release. Barnaby had inherited the Riverside Retreat from a distant relative many years before we met. From the start, he established it as his untouchable private refuge. Every weekend, he would depart, claiming he needed to disconnect, that he was going fishing, emphasizing that it was a man's space. "That place isn't for you," he would repeat casually. He never once extended an invitation. In more than 2 decades of marriage, I became the wife who remained home, prepared his clothes for Monday, and asked no questions. If I brought up the house, he immediately changed the subject. If I hinted at wanting to see it, he would simply laugh. Over time, the secluded cabin became the concrete symbol of everything he hid from me. And without me knowing it, it also became the key to everything I was about to discover about myself. The day he died, I knew I would eventually go there, not for him, but for me. 1 week after the burial, I set about the difficult task of sorting through his possessions, wanting to close chapters and purge the house of the lingering sense of control. In a brittle plastic folder, I located all the legal documents for the Marsh cabin, the deed, utility bills, and maintenance records. Everything remained solely in his name. Holding that official document felt like physically grasping the chains of my own lengthy confinement. I seriously contemplated selling it immediately, wanting to eliminate anything that evoked those solitary weekends or hollow excuses. That house represented too much pain. But before I could deliver the papers to the lawyer, an urgent necessity drove me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. This was not morbid curiosity. I needed to close that specific door myself. I departed early one Saturday morning, alone. I packed only essentials, including an old brass key I had found concealed at the bottom of his dresser drawer. I clung to it fiercely, treating it like a long-delayed invitation. The route to the retreat was isolated, lined with silence. With every mile I traveled, my chest tightened. When I finally stopped in front of the rusted iron gate, my heart was pounding relentlessly. No cars were parked, but something felt strange. The mailbox contained recent correspondence. The grass was freshly cut, and the driveway showed signs of frequent use. I approached slowly, key in hand. I didn't even know if I had the right to be there, but an internal force pushed me forward. This specific location no longer belonged to Barnaby. It was a space I finally had the authority to access, and I was determined to cross that threshold. The moment I stepped through the main entrance, I froze. There were clothes hanging neatly on the back deck, a basket overflowing with toys next to the stone fireplace, and the scent of cooked food floating in the air. This was undeniably not the appearance of a property that had been abandoned for days. On the contrary, it felt like an actively inhabited, lived-in home, adhering to its own regular rhythm. The floor was clean, the dining table held a vase of fresh flowers, and a small bicycle was propped near the window. All these small details completely destabilized me. I stood motionless, not daring to move forward. It was then that I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway, followed by a woman's soft, natural voice calling out a familiar name. Barnaby. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. That voice wasn't searching for me, and in that horrifying instant, I knew with absolute certainty that this house wasn't just guarding old secrets. This house was inhabited. I knocked softly, even though my heart was threatening to rupture. Within seconds, the door opened, revealing a young woman, perhaps 28 years old, whose belly was visibly swollen from an advanced pregnancy. Her face initially registered surprise, quickly hardening into suspicion. Before I could speak, she asked cautiously, "Who are you?" I stated my name, Alara, then added in a firm but calm voice, "I'm Barnaby's wife." Her pupils dilated dramatically, and her expression completely changed. She instinctively took a step backwards, opening the door wider, still staring, entirely speechless. She silently gestured for me to enter. The woman introduced herself as Sylvie Miro. She couldn't stop looking at me, her gaze filled with a mix of confusion and profound distress. Her hands trembled slightly, resting protectively on her belly. When I quietly confirmed that Barnaby had died a week earlier, she instantly covered her mouth and her eyes welled up with tears. She told me she thought he was away on the business trip and that he was scheduled to return the following day. No one had notified her. For her, he was still alive. She began to weep silently, staring fixedly at the floor. After a few minutes of shared heavy silence, she began to speak. She confessed that she had been in a committed relationship with Barnaby for almost 4 years. He had explicitly told her he was single, that he traveled a lot for his work, which was why he only visited the retreat on weekends. I listened in silence. Every word she uttered was a blunt blow, a complete parallel existence, another woman, another home. I didn't want to attack her or assign blame because her pain was real, pure, and tragically identical to mine. She too had been deceived, felt betrayed, and was utterly ruined. She looked me in the eyes and said, almost afraid, "I didn't know he was married. I swear I never would have allowed it." And I believed her, instantly. There was no trace of lies in her voice, only devastating heartbreak. Sylvie retrieved a cardboard box filled with photographs. Inside, I found pictures of them together at the beach, dining out, and even embracing and smiling like a real couple right there in the living room. I also discovered handwritten notes, birthday cards signed by him, and small, thoughtful gifts. All of this constructed a history I knew nothing about. What I realized without a shred of doubt was that this day marked an irreversible before and after in my life, because nothing I had believed to be true remained standing. Sylvie explained that she met Barnaby when she was working as a barista. According to her, he was charming, well-mannered, even tender. He spoke about his supposed role as a traveling sales representative, his constant travel, and the difficulty of maintaining a relationship with his lifestyle. He never mentioned being married. As Sylvie recounted these details, I felt a part of me silently breaking. Every lie Barnaby had told so casually felt like an invisible slap. She confessed that with time, he proposed they formalize their relationship. They bought furnishings together, painted the cabin, and spoke at length about raising children. He promised her a future, family stability, and she believed him, just as I had believed him years ago. The identical words, the same naive hope, shared by two distinct women, all predicated on one massive lie sustained for years. Sylvie showed me a small box containing baby booties, a rattle, and a white onesie. She said they had purchased them together just a week prior. He had been excited, speaking about the impending baby as if it were the only important thing in his life. He had promised to register the child under his name, look for a larger apartment, and even mentioned marriage. It all sounded so solid, so planned, that it gave me chills. He had executed this exact plan before, with me. I watched her and saw myself reflected in her present. She was broken, but she didn't yet realize the full extent of the deception. She still needed to comprehend that her story, too, was unreal, merely a recycled script used with different women. I remained silent, swallowing the bitterness, because deep down, I was also wrestling with guilt for not having suspected him sooner, for having been silent for so long. She showed me recent text messages from Barnaby, tender and affectionate, discussing baby names. The final message was sent just 3 days before his death. "Miss you both," accompanied by a heart emoji. She broke down crying as she read it aloud. I also found an unfinished letter where he wrote that his life only made sense since the day he met Sylvie. I felt a searing mix of rage and emptiness. What hurt me most wasn't the sexual betrayal, but having lived so many years alongside someone who never truly showed me who he was. I felt like my life had been a carefully constructed facade where I only played the limiting role he assigned me. And now I was discovering that I hadn't even been the sole actor. We were two women deceived by the identical leading man. I didn't shed a single tear in that moment. I felt utterly empty. When she finally composed herself, she looked at me and said, "I didn't know he was married. I swear if I had known, I never would have been with him." Her voice trembled, but what I saw on her face wasn't guilt, it was disbelief. She too was a victim, albeit from a different angle. I nodded slowly. There was nothing to forgive. The single architect of this tangled web was Barnaby. We spent hours engaged in conversation, never raising our voices, just letting the words come out when they were ready. We listened to one another as if we had needed this connection for years without ever realizing it. We were not looking for fault between us, only answers and pieces of truth. It was a painful conversation, but entirely necessary. When I stood up to depart, she walked me to the door. We looked at each other in silence, And then, without planning it, we hugged. It was an awkward, brief, but profoundly sincere gesture. Two women broken by the same man, finding comfort in a shared truth. I drove away with a tight chest, but I was clear that I no longer wanted to drag the chains of a life that had been forced upon me. It was time to write my own. During the long drive back to Bayview, I couldn't stop thinking about Sylvie. Her distraught face, her fragile body, protecting the child of a man who had betrayed us both. She was isolated, pregnant, lacking resources, and no family nearby. I felt a powerful human responsibility, not to Barnaby's memory, but to her and that child. I couldn't sit idly by while another woman paid the consequences for a lie she didn't initiate. I felt that in a profound way, helping her was also beginning to help myself. I was finally starting to listen to my own inner voice. The following weekend, I returned to the Riverside retreat with bags of baby clothes, groceries, and books. I wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that not all the bonds in her life had to be marked by abandonment. She opened the door, surprised to see me. I left the bags on the table and told her she didn't have to decide anything that day. I just came to be there. We spoke little during lunch, but the atmosphere was softer. I told her about my own life, how I had learned to keep quiet, and how loneliness had been my constant companion. She listened intently. When she admitted she didn't have the strength to plan for the baby's birth, I proposed helping her find a small apartment in Bayview, close to my house. I stressed that it was not an obligation and I expected nothing in return. When she asked why, I replied, "Because you're not to blame. Because I was where you were now, and no one reached out to me when I needed it most." A week later, I secured a small, cozy studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I furnished it with only the essentials, keeping Sylvie and the baby's comfort in mind. When I called to tell her it was ready, she paused, then said, her voice cracking, "I don't know how to thank you for this." I helped her move. Upon arrival, she slowly walked through the space, then turned to me, tears in her eyes, and hugged me. We were forging something new, an honest partnership between two wounded women who had decided to not remain silent anymore. It didn't take long for the first poisonous comments to arrive. Barnaby's sister, Brenda, called me, stating she was ashamed. "You're fouling your husband's memory," she declared, speaking of family honor and the impropriety of getting close to the other woman. I simply replied, "Do what you need to do," and hung up the phone without feeling guilty. I was not going to justify myself. My silence had only damaged me. Sylvie was not my enemy. She was the tragic consequence of a lie I had also unknowingly been part of. Helping her was a way of breaking the cycle. After settling Sylvie in, I made a firm decision. I would sell the Riverside retreat. I never wanted to set foot in it again. That place was too saturated with secrets and lies. It no longer belonged to me emotionally. I contacted a realtor, handed over the keys, and signed all the documents without looking back. It felt like closing a painful door that had been hurting me for years. By closing it, I felt like I could finally breathe. When I told Sylvie the sale was finalized, she looked at me in silence and quietly said, "You've been braver than you know." I felt neither nostalgia nor anger, just a strange, profound peace, as if I had recovered a vital piece of myself that I thought was lost. Slowly, Sylvie and I built a genuine bond that transcended the circumstances. We didn't talk every day, but we were present for each other when needed. I accompanied her to ultrasounds and helped her with paperwork. Our relationship stopped being just occasional aid and transformed into true companionship. The day she went into labor, she called me. I drove her to the hospital. For hours, I stayed by her side, holding her hand and calming her. When the baby boy was finally born, I felt a profound tenderness. When she asked me to hold him, something inside me released. This baby signified something new and clean. He represented the end of a lie and the beginning of a different story. In that moment, I felt that Barnaby no longer held any power over me. A few weeks later, I started therapy. I wanted to understand why I had allowed so much neglect and abuse for so many years. Each session felt like opening a sealed box. I uncovered wounds I had normalized and silences I had mistaken for peace. Facing these truths was difficult, but I knew I had to if I truly wanted to rebuild myself. I began writing things I had never dared to say out loud. I cried some nights, but not out of sadness. They were tears of liberating release. I was learning how to let go of the past, not to forget it, but to refuse to let it define me anymore. My therapist recommended a women's support group that met every Thursday afternoon. I went, and soon discovered I was not crazy, nor overreacting, nor weak. I was simply a woman who survived as best she could in an environment that didn't allow her to flourish. Those afternoons became my sanctuary. I began to rebuild myself from a new foundation, the truth. One afternoon after one of those meetings, I sat on a public bench while Ethan Miller, a man with a measured voice and a serene gaze, who was also leading the center, approached me. We chatted easily about the difficulty of starting over. He disclosed that he had been a widower for 3 years and was also in therapy. There was no aggressive intent to flirt, only present, respectful attention. For subsequent weeks, we ran into each other on that same bench, sharing conversation or comfortable silence. He never tried to force his way into my life. With Ethan, I didn't feel the need to explain or justify my past. He listened respectfully without trying to fix me or judge my history. For me, that was already good love, the kind that doesn't weigh you down. With Ethan, I learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real, that a gentle touch can heal more than 1,000 empty words, and that everyday respect is worth more than grand promises. He didn't try to save me or replace what I had lost. I began to open my world to him not out of need, but out of choice. It was a love that didn't come to fill holes, but to walk alongside me. I kept going to therapy, but now I did it accompanied. Ethan reminded me that the past doesn't define what I deserve, and that after the chaos, there can also be calm. When Ethan proposed marriage, it was not with a prepared speech, but one afternoon while we were raking leaves in the yard. He looked at me tenderly and said, "We can make this something more permanent if you want." I simply smiled because I already knew the answer. We organized a simple ceremony in a small backyard garden. There was no loud music, only truth, white flowers, and a silent promise to care for each other without causing harm. Sylvie and her son were present, seated in the front row as part of my new story. Tom took Sylvie's hand at the end of the ceremony and thanked her for being there. That wedding wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a conscious, honest beginning, free of masks and ghosts. Love didn't heal all my wounds, but it helped me not to bleed alone. In time, we had 2 more children. I wasn't seeking perfection. I was seeking only calm, balance, and truth. Sylvie remained a constant presence. Our children played together, growing up like cousins, bound by ties stronger than blood. I no longer lived with the constant anxiety of needing to please or justify every decision. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think about Barnaby, not with anger or nostalgia, but with a cold distance that no longer hurts. He was part of my life, but he doesn't define it. He left a trail of pain that took years to disappear, but he also, inadvertently, pushed me towards a freedom I never would have imagined. Forgiving him meant letting go of the heavy weight I no longer wanted to carry. It was my way of breaking free from that shadow and walking towards my own light. Now I know what it means to live without fear, without a disguise, without the need to fit into someone else's mold. My house smells of fresh baked bread, open books, and sincere laughter. I've stopped looking for approval in the eyes of others because I finally learned to recognize myself in the mirror. This is me, Alara, the woman who was invisible for years and now shines without permission. And if I've learned anything throughout this journey, it's that living is worth it, even if it hurts